So, shall we start with a acknowledgement of country? Uh,
Yes.
for me, I'm here on the lands, very much the waters on a rainy day, and the skies of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and I want to pay my respect and my admiration for care and connection with what we call country or land, air, and waters, skies and waters. Um, People have been living here for tens of thousands of years, and it's a beautiful thing to be so closely connected with country. So thank you for that care and for that inspiration to the rest of us.
Well, I'm in the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation, also known colonially as Ottawa in Canada. And this region was a meeting point. There are a number of indigenous names that are carried, the river and the bridges and many spaces, but people don't know the history very well, and I do what I can to be aware of who is here, who was here, who is here, and how we can better live together in this land of the Algonquin. So very grateful to be here. So Yin, I had the privilege of hearing you speak on April 23rd at a Quillwood Academy presentation you gave. And I didn't know your work before, but I'm very happy that we have time to talk today. And luckily, that presentation is on your YouTube channel, and I put the link in the episode notes so people can, and I really encourage them to listen and see that presentation because it's very rich. And uh, I wanted to start just, you've done a partial introduction, but you could maybe tell us a little bit more about your background, who you are, and then we'll jump into some of the topics around deep listening and around the role of art and see where that goes. But let's start at the beginning with your origins.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks, Claude. So I'm an Australian. If we're going to talk nation states, which are interesting things to talk about. So I was born on this smallest continent in the world towards the north. So mostly lived and born and lived in the north of Australia, which is of course quite warm and subtropical, if not tropical in some parts. And my background in terms of sort of ancestry is quite mixed. My dad's from the Philippines. My mum is Aboriginal and also Anglo-Australian, as it's called, lots of English heritage as well. And my grandmother was born on our Aboriginal country where we trace our lineage, which is up also northern parts of Australia. And my grandmother was part of what we call here the stolen generations. There's many, of course, similarities in other countries of authorities engaged in assimilation, stealing children and taking them away, raising them with white families. So she was part of that story. And of course, that's one of the great traumas of modernity for Indigenous peoples. Eradication was probably more of a problem at the start, and then we got the assimilation stuff. It's all added up to be quite a large intergenerational trauma complex that we're working with. So I started, always wanted to be an academic of various kinds and ended up working in Indigenous health and moving down to the southern parts, the colder parts of Australia some years ago. And, moving from Indigenous health to an interest in racism and health and then anti-racism and then decolonization, Indigenous knowledges over the years. And so that's what brings me to my current academic interests and something I'm passionate about sharing with others.
Well, the presentation you gave was called "How Did Humans Live Before Modern Societies?" which is really something that I haven't thought a lot about. But I had a really good feeling of when you were distinguishing between primal and modern societies, and there's lots to talk about there, but maybe you can just give us an overview of why you distinguish the two. I think I know, but some of the key characteristics between those two very different worlds.
Yeah, yeah. So really drawing from history, obviously before written history, more anthropology, archaeology sort of studies, there's this sense that human societies used to be what we call primal. All of them used to be primal. And then something happened about 10 to 12,000 years ago. And as far as we know, quite new things appeared. So human history as a species is at least 330,000 years old. So we've been going for a while. But in the last 10 to 12,000 years, we developed these kind of things like uh, strong forms of patriarchy, more densely populated cities or towns, agriculture, a sense of a stronger sense of hierarchy that goes along with that patriarchy and things like kings and queens developed, and that became hereditary, which was also quite a strange thing for primal societies. Money, literacy or writing, lots of things that we take for granted in modern societies, but a lot of primal societies, and also let's talk about indigenous peoples living even in the last few hundred years. And today, of course, a lot of modernity has encroached on indigenous cultures, but a lot of indigenous cultures also lack these things that we've discussed, and have other things instead, which make them indigenous or primal. Things like strong sense of egalitarianism, strong sense of relational autonomy, lots of interest and engagement in things like kinship, reciprocity, uh, societies with distributed authority and very different approaches to decision making, child rearing, these sort of things. And obviously societies that are smaller in the sense that there's less people and people live more uh, in a more distributed way in smaller groups. And technology levels is another one. That's a big difference that a lot of technology has developed over the last several thousand years. So I think it's fairly easy for people to see that there's big differences from what we might call indigenous societies and modern societies. But some of the reasons for that, the values, the life ways, maybe are not quite as obvious to people.
Right, and I've studied with Vanessa Andreotti and her colleagues in the Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures collective work, and the idea of demodernization and decolonization is becoming understood now as we see that modernity is quite self-destructive, even though it has attributes, right? There's good things. The fact that we're speaking today through technology is an outcome of modernity, but it is highly problematic. And I appreciated that the way that walked us through the history and from your point of view, but also giving a fair shake to modernity in the sense that there were some good things, there are some good things, but ultimately it has been traumatic for many, many people around the world and continues to be. And we're going into a period of, I don't know what word to use, transformation. Um, And you didn't talk directly about art, but I felt that when you were speaking, you talked about art all the time, stories and metaphor, and the language that you used, cyclic, rhythmic, inside grounded, outside presence, and other side horizontal time where the future can't be remembered, the past is yet to come, and now is a spatial, slushy, rippled texture every when. Beautiful words, and I'd like you to talk a bit about art and how it fits into your research and your own thoughts on the place of art in primal cultures.
Yes, yeah, it's a good question. That quote is about time and temporalities, and primal peoples and cultures have very different conceptions of time to modern societies. Modern societies are more about linear clock time, so that's an interesting angle to discuss. But art itself, I think, is something that's also done very differently, that's lived very differently between primal and modern societies. So in primal cultures, there's a tendency to interweave everything with everything else, including art. So people are very creative and expressive in everyday life, through ceremony and ritual, dance and art and carving and weaving and various aspects of life that are just considered quite normal for primal peoples. Uh, but part of primal cultures is a strong engagement with and resonance with eccentricity and uniqueness. So people do things, even hunting, is an art form that people do in different ways, and that's that broad kind of church in a sense of acceptance of those unique ways is unusual in modernity, where we tend to think of ourselves as individualistic, but there's a lot of conformity that's involved really in modern societies. People are expected to conform to fairly narrow ways of being. So art is not a separate domain in primal cultures, as it seems to be mostly um, in modernity. And some people have said, when talking about primal cultures, that there was an art. But they also say there wasn't science, and that even language was something that, although primal peoples had, they didn't use as much as we do. They didn't talk as much. So it's semantics in a way. If you don't name something separately as art, is there art? And uh, doesn't really matter how you answer that question. But certainly what people did, um, as I said, was very creative and expressive. And there were many ways of doing that through everyday life and sociality, with each other. And really, I think that one of the big differences about primal cultures that we underestimate is how much we can grow and expand and increase our kind of range of skills and abilities through having such close kinship with so many people. When you're in a tribe of hundreds of people, really close, it's compared to a nuclear family of, half a dozen people, usually at most. It just has some really great effects on kickstarting the human brain, I guess, in a broader sense, not just the brain on top of your neck. And that is art. That expression, that creativity comes through that learning and growing and relating with so many people, and also, of course, animals and plants that are part of the kinship system too.
Yeah, the Western world, the modern world, has separated art from nature and other relations that we have, and some of it's great. There's these magnificent works of art, but they kind of sit in a in relative isolation from the rest of human activity. Um, and I think that's problematic, but I'm also grateful that so many works of art have been part of my culture. I'm connected to it, but I also feel the disconnect of it to the rest of the world. So I
Mm.
appreciate your insights. And the other thing I want to talk to you about is deep listening, because when the slides went by, I'm one of those who asked a question at that session, and I was really um, happy to see the language that you used, tuning into the cadence, rhyme, and timbre of silence and stillness, rather than the speed, stimulation, and satisfaction of modernity. And many of the people I talk to who work in the field of acoustic ecology talk about listening and slowing down. And I think the world is understanding that is something that's necessary for modernity to kind of stop being so aggressive and eventually transform, is that notion of slowing down. So what are your thoughts on listening and then the notion of deep listening as you described it in your presentation?
Yeah. I'd also like to hear from you about your take on listening and being, which you mentioned was a bit different from the way that I uh, outlined it. But yeah, I'm happy to start, and
Mhm.
I'm interested in yeah, listening and deep listening, and there's not really that much difference between them. I think all listening should probably be deep and attentive and really inhabit what I call soft fascination or gentle curiosity with the world. And it's, as you said, it's a kind of a pulling back from that aggressive sense of acquisition and instrumentality of modernity, where everything is, well, the world is thingified in the sense that we treat each other as and objects in the world as things that are not really worthy of our attention. Deep listening is more about having that humility that we have everything to learn or something to learn from any aspect of the cosmos that we are in relationship with or entangled with. And so that, yeah, that sense of slowing down is about cultivating a different way of being aware. It's not so much just about speed. It's about uh, a sort of state of consciousness in a way. And primal people certainly inhabited states of consciousness that we really don't even know much about in modernity. More trance-like states, very few of us reach those in modernity because we've stopped doing the activities that cultivate them. So the stillness and silence is, in a way, it's really just about, uh, it's another phrase that will people may find challenging. Really, it's about conspiring with the cosmos. So the word conspiring actually means to breathe with. So it's about breathing with the cosmos, whatever speed and rhyme and timbre that is. It's not an absence. It's not a kind of blank slate, but it's a tuning in. Yeah. Or sometimes I talk about murmurating, a murmuration. When birds all move together as a flock in the sky, starlings are a classic. That's murmuration, and humans can do that too. We can murmurate with the cosmos. So deep listening is really about that. Yeah, I was just saying that you always get, where I am anyway, little noises popping up and during podcasts of everyday life. And it reminds me that what I mentioned before about the sort of blank canvas of summer traditions aiming for a kind of meditation of nothingness, and silence is the same in that sense that uh, for me there's always a kind of susurrating undulation or undulating susurrations of life. So there's never complete stillness or complete silence, and I think that that's really important for us to connect with that notion that there's always something happening. It's always on the cosmos is always on the move and vibrating with sound, and it's good to try and learn more about and connect with that rather than sort of try and achieve a blank silence. And Reminds me of the artist actually, John Cage,
Mm.
uh, who famously did that piece of, which was a musical piece of silence in four parts, and each part was marked by the closing of the piano, which made a noise. And his invitation was for people to understand that there's no such thing as silence, and that's a kind of important point that I just wanted to mention.
Well, in this episode, I'll insert a part of another episode where somebody tells a story. That piece is called 4 minutes, 33 seconds of Cage. And there was a professor at a university who was doing the piece in a class. And then they said, well, there's too much. There was a protest about an encampment about the war in Gaza. And the person said, well, can't do the piece now because there's too much sound outside.
Yeah,
And the irony
exactly.
of a university professor of music thinking that that wouldn't be part of the piece.
Yeah,
I find that it's illustrative of how people have both improved their listening because we talk about Cage's work a lot more, and yet they don't. Some people still don't get it. That
yeah,
it's
yeah,
all about listening to everything around you, and everything is interconnected, and there is no such thing as silence. And if we pay attention to the sounds around us, we'll be enriched as opposed to just narrowly trying to experience a work of art, and excluding everything else.
yeah.
When I
It's
Sorry.
like this sense that oh, this is not a good time to do art, or this is not a good time to engage in deep listening because there's too much going on. It's let's do it another time. It's a bit like that.
But when I was a child, I studied music, and at one point somebody said, "What do you like about music?" And I said, "Well, to be honest, I like the hallway, the sounds of people in the hallway, and I like the birds outside of the window, and I like the silence at the end of the performance before people clap.
Mm.
Sometimes it's a few seconds, sometimes it's quite long, and it's one of the most beautiful resonant times, because we're all in harmony. Even though the performance was beautiful, so I'm a context listener, right? And people always thought it was very strange because why wouldn't you listen to the music? And so yeah, I listen to the music, but everything around it's pretty cool too.
Yeah, that's a great example. Yeah.
Well, from my point of view, um, worked with a composer named Murray Schafer, who interestingly wrote a book called The Tuning of the World. But it wasn't the tuning of the cosmos, but I think it was a similar intention, but much more rational approach in the sense of analytical and, we have noise issues, therefore we will understand the environment and change it. But I think intuitively, Murray and many of my colleagues have similar listening approaches to the ones you just spoke about. We just won't use the same words, but as fellow humans, we do connect through listening, and it does bring us into meditative relationships with all kinds of things. We just do it without maybe the space, like we're so um, uh, obsessed with control and trying to shape things. We don't allow them to unfold as much as we could or should. But I do see that's why I was really struck by the language because it resonates with me and what I do. I'm a Qigong practitioner and I do different things to listen to the body, not just through the ears and certainly not just with the mind, because the mind is a sort of ongoing chatterbox of thoughts and there's other forms of intelligence which call them primal or indigenous communities have understood through time. It's just always been there. So with the notion of deep listening, there's a composer, an American composer, Pauline Oliveros, who developed a whole school around deep listening, right? And she did a lot of research, and she was very informed about Buddhism and many types of world cultures. And so I think we have much more in common than we do in differences. But it's so refreshing to see language and to hear you speak about deep listening as it connects to other ways, to deeper ways of being, right? Listening is, in a way, a metaphor for being present, um, if that makes sense.
Yes, yes, it does. And I think there's connections with the notion of art as well, and art as a kind of not so much something to consume in a capitalist culture, but as a kind of, so not something that necessarily moves you at speed and stimulating, but as something like deep listening, something that steals you. Art, a good, art as something that steals uh, and 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 challenges and kind of transforms and metamorphosizes you into something else. And I think deep listening is like that too. It's a kind of a pause or a series of pauses that can become ruptures of the mundane and take us into different worlds, different realms that we can learn to inhabit. And then we get into those states of consciousness that are different from the left brain, linear, logical, literal, rational. That's important, but is just out of balance in modern societies, I would say.
Yeah, and Vanessa Andreotti's work and others have made that very clear, the things that we need to do to unlearn and decolonize and lighten our burden of modernity and
Mm.
just live in a much more simple way, but a much more connected way to what we do, like the notion of shit, which, the composting shit is something she speaks about very openly, it's there, it's coming out of us and it needs to be composted. I just love that. That directness, right? Of this is life, and these are the ways that we have lost our way and suggesting. And that, in fact, that's my next question for you, Yin. You're very generous in your presentations. You make them available and you give tips and suggestions, invitations, and as well as challenges to people who are curious to know more. What is your sense of sharing? How does that, what is your intention or your purpose in sharing the knowledge, your knowledge in the way that you do?
Well, I think that knowledge is something that is a collaborative emergence rather than a product. So it's a process that people do together, and it's something that is very much connected to co-liberation. So knowledge, when I mean say knowledge, I mean something that comes from the sort of etymology of the word, which is a gnosis, a kind of a word that means to touch. And so knowledge is very much for me about the tangible, the tactile, the haptic, the kinesthetic, these sort of aspects of um, life, really. And so knowledge, art, deep listening, these all are connected and related. And so, yeah, sharing is natural in that sense. Obviously, there are levels of sharing, and primal cultures certainly had and continue to have a kind of a graduated approach to sharing knowledge, introductory to advanced, and mostly just for the sake of the people, safety of people learning stuff and safety of country. You've got to get good at knife throwing before you practice with live targets, that sort of thing, as a metaphor.
I'll keep
So
that.
yeah, so knowledge, yeah, I'm really, as I said, passionate about sharing, and a bit like the group that Vanessa's works with, the gesturing towards decolonial futures. They're very generous with their knowledge as well, and it's about giving people some tools and some tips, as you say, to learn more if they're interested in Indigenous ways of knowing, being, doing, of decolonization. Because, as you alluded to earlier, we are in this very much the pointy end of, I would say, late stage modernity, and giving people some sense that there's other ways of living is very important at this juncture, because the way of life that modernity has kind of fostered is unsustainable, and people are really feeling that in various ways around the world.
Well, my last question will be the beginning, in a way, of my next season of my podcast, because I'm going to be exploring art in times of crisis and how art plays a role, not just in healing, but when people are under strain and stress, what art can do, what it has done, what it is doing, and what it can do in the future, knowing what we're about to face. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, art is very important in a time of crisis that we find ourselves in. Just to emphasize that art is something that we can all do. It's not that elitist sense of that I find a lot of people in modernity struggle with. Even the most basic stuff like singing and dancing. Oh, I'm not very good at singing, or I'm not very good at dancing, so I'm not going to do it. I'll leave it to the experts. And I think art is a very much a collaborative or co-liberative activity that we can all do. And it's also something that in a time of crisis is gives us a sense of that rupture that I talked about, that ability to kind of summon sensorial portals uh, that give us a glimpse of other ways, uh, other life ways. And art is in that is a kind of a wake up call in a lot of ways, and an opportunity to reflect back on ourselves, have a good look at ourselves, and have an expansion of our imagination to go beyond how we imagine ourselves to be to something else. Because there's so much more, and art is tapping into that, or embodying that sense of so much more. Sometimes called the other wise, the wiseness of other ways. So it's a glimpsing um, of vaster entities, really, spiritual or otherwise. And I think art can very much lead the way in terms of giving us those capacities to compost our own shit and to reimagine ourselves and our world, and importantly, probably most importantly, to re-enchant and reconsecrate our world, because to be enchanted by the world is to grow in kinship and care and reverence and reciprocity with the world.
Well, I come back to the very beginning of our conversation when we did land acknowledgements and gestures of gratitude, and I'm feeling the light go down here in this side of the world and connected to you on the other side of the world, literally. So it's really interesting. We share the same light and the
Yeah.
same air, and I think as I learn to feel more than think, I start noticing things like how the light is leaving us and has accompanied me through my day and given me all these wonderful sights, and just to live in a more simple, grateful way, I think is something that many people are trying to do, and they're finding it within themselves when they take away some of those layers of obsession and compulsion and whatever it is that drives them, then there's something beautiful under there that's always been there, right?
Mm. Yes, yes, it has always been there. And I think we just lose sight of it, or come out of contact, felt contact with that immense beauty and um, yeah, wonder of life.
Well, I always ask my guests at the end what they're reading or listening to these days, what would be interested in sharing to our listeners in terms of things that you recommend.
Yeah, good question. I reckon people should make their way to some works of Darren Allen. He's somebody who talks a lot about primal cultures and modern cultures, and you can find his work if you look up the term expressive egg. Expressive egg. And there's blogs and well, there's no podcast. There's blogs and books, and any of them are a great place to start.
Mm. And of course, your own writings, I'll put your website and your YouTube channel because that, in fact, we could probably put this recording on your YouTube channel if you wish as well, because why not?
Good idea. Yeah.
They could see the light decreasing, the light increasing in Australia, decreasing
Yeah,
in
the
Canada.
sun, the same sun shining upon us.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Ian. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thought good to talk.